Hi, I'm Len Rydell, Executive Director of the Blue and Gray Education Society. And again, I'd like to welcome you to another in the series of 5 lectures that compose the initial presentation of Blue and Gray Education Society's very first symposium and tour back in October 1994, covering the 7 Days campaign. This is the first of our featured lectures that will talk about this very special relationship, an important relationship between Commanding General George B. McClellan of the Union Army and Commander-in-Chief President Abraham Lincoln. That relationship is a complex relationship, one that is not easily understood until you understand the personalities involved. George McClellan was a man in his 30s who probably was promoted way above his pay grade early on. He certainly proved to be an outstanding organizer, but a very nervous and uncomfortable field commander whose uncertainty in the field created disharmony within the political ranks in Washington, D.C., and created opportunities missed in numerous elements of his short command tenure at the head of the Army of the Potomac. To do this, I went looking in the early days of Blue and Gray. I didn't really know a lot of people, so I did like most people. I just went and looked on the shelf to see who had written books about what I was interested in presenting, and a recent book that had just come out had talked about partners in command, of which it dealt with a series of relationships that resulted in success and in some instances failure in military operations during the Civil War. The author of this was a man who at the time was a professor of history at the University of Houston, which was a pretty far piece from Richmond, Virginia. But we had early on vowed that we were going to be intellectually honest in everything, and we were going to find the best qualified people to present the themes that we thought were important components to help you understand the campaign that we were presenting. And so I approached Dr. Glatthaar, and he was generous enough, although he didn't know me from Adam, he was generous enough with his time to agree to come to Richmond and to make this presentation on the relationship between George McClellan and Abraham Lincoln. I found it to be particularly interesting, and in the hour that follows, I think you're going to find that there is much to chew on there, as this is certainly one of the enigmas of the Civil War, what might have been if McClellan had had a different personality or had had the same sort of field presence that he had in terms of his intellectual insight and his organizational abilities. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Joe Glatthaar.
Failures with authority figures. In youth, he clashed with teachers, including Bass, so he claimed. Throughout his military career in the 1840s and 1850s, battles with superiors plagued him. Among his sundry foes were the Secretary of War and the Chief Engineer of the Army, a brigadier general. In both instances, I might add, McClellan held the rank of a second lieutenant, and his sheer impertinence was what irritated the most. Even as a railroad engineer in civil life before the war, he stirred up trouble with his bosses. The struggles with the commander-in-chief then set a lifelong pattern. For Lincoln, the removal of McClellan culminated 16 months of frustration. The president took considerable pains to assemble a massive army and staggering quantities of resources to crush the rebellion. Yet McClellan failed to advance vigorously or fight aggressively. All the while, the general hurled complaints, slights, insults, brash remarks, and petulant characterizations at him. Lincoln could endure that, but neither the commander-in-chief nor the nation could tolerate McClellan's hesitance to campaign any longer. As the president explained to a cabinet member, McClellan has got the slows. When the war broke out, McClellan was a highly touted figure. Of course, he graduated second in his West Point class, had served on Winfield Scott's staff in the Mexican War, and had been a railroad engineer of high rank. He received the official military rank of Major General in the militia and commanded all Ohio volunteers early on. Active and enterprising, McClellan began the tedious process of converting civilians into soldiers. His seemingly boundless level of energy, his insistence on overseeing every detail, and his strong administrative capacity convinced soldiers, politicians, and civilians alike that he possessed a rare talent for military affairs. Within weeks, he won an appointment to Major General in the regular army. On his fourth day in uniform, McClellan submitted without solicitation his first strategic plan of operation. The plan called for him to assemble an army of some 80,000 men, cross the Ohio River, push through the Kanawha Valley, cut across the Shenandoah Valley, and advance on the Confederate capital. He hoped that that movement, in coordination with another advance from directly to the north towards Richmond, would lead to the fall of that city and perhaps break the back of the rebellion. As an alternative, he could drive his 80,000-man army through Kentucky into Nashville, Tennessee, and from there march on Montgomery, Alabama. He thought supporting columns could fight along the Charleston, South Carolina, Augusta, Georgia axis, with the two commands ultimately targeting Pensacola, Florida, Mobile, Alabama, or New Orleans. Again, by implication, he would command the primary army. The problem with his plans were that they ignored logistics. They also ignored Kentucky's neutrality, and they failed to consider that such a massive movement would require tremendous amounts of support from the Navy. The plans were absurd. At the time, Lincoln deferred militarily to his seasoned commanding general, Winfield Scott. Now, Scott had earned a fabulous reputation from the Battle of Chippewa in the War of 1812 and had done a magnificent job of commanding the American Army in the Mexican War. Scott esteemed McClellan's abilities. Rather than critique McClellan's plan, Scott drew him into his confidence. The government was about to raise 85,000 men for at least 3 years, and they would launch a campaign to seize the Mississippi River. It is not improbable, Scott concluded, you may be invited to take an important part in the expedition downriver. Scott's sensitive response only fueled McClellan's passion to hoist his views among the high councils. Intruding on the affairs of neighboring departments, he buttressed his advice and requests to the haughty Scott with such expressions as, the general under whom I learned my first lessons in war and whom I have been and ever shall be ready to support to the bitter end. That opinion doesn't last long. Or, next to maintaining the honor of my country, General, the first aim of my life is to justify the good opinion you have expressed concerning me and to prove that the great soldier of our country can not only command armies himself, but teach others to do so. Meanwhile, McClellan filed protests with the Secretary of War and Secretary of the Treasury over a lack of direction from the General-in-Chief and a neglect to control key geographic positions. Scott rebuked him, but that did not deter McClellan. Several days later, he telegraphed the governor of Ohio, General Scott is, as you are aware, eminently sensitive and does not at all times take suggestions kindly from military subordinates, especially when they conflict with his own preconceived notions. Sort of self-descriptive, I think. By the end of May, obviously I'm a big fan of George McClellan. By the end of May, McClellan had circumvented the entire command structure and submitted his ideas directly to the president. Now, Confederate troops had penetrated into Unionist West Virginia, and Scott called on McClellan to quote-unquote counteract the influence. As it turned out, McClellan bungled the campaign, but the Confederates bungled it even worse, and eventually Union forces routed a smaller Confederate command. In and of itself, it wasn't a particularly monumental victory, but the event occurred within a few days of the Union defeat at First Manassas, and so McClellan was quickly elevated into superstar status. On July 22nd, authorities called McClellan to Washington and appointed him commander of the Division of the Potomac. Now, the Lincoln-McClellan relationship had dated back to the 1850s. When McClellan worked for the Illinois Central Railroad, Lincoln had acted as one of its attorneys. Neither the man nor his politics impressed McClellan much, as the railroad executive strongly supported Lincoln's opponent, Stephen A. Douglas, during the 1858 senatorial campaign. The day after McClellan's arrival in Washington, the two men met again in the White House to discuss the new position. Gathering at the presidential mansion was a scene of contrasts. McClellan, short, thick, mustached, appeared every bit a soldier, as if he had been born to wear the uniform. At 34 years of age, McClellan represented youth, power, and energy to onlookers. The tall, gaunt Lincoln looked awkward, even in civilian garb. McClellan, senior by nearly 2 decades, the new president startled people with his unusual height, sinewy frame, and odd features. Personality accentuated the distinctions. McClellan retained a cool, aloof, proper bearing that conveyed an image of direction and business-like habits. Lincoln, by comparison, was personable, jocular, and informal, almost too casual to observers for the gravity of the current crisis. As a result, most people underestimated Lincoln. No one walked away from an initial encounter with McClellan unimpressed. But differences transcended physical and social qualities. McClellan came from a refined Philadelphia family, trained and educated as an officer and a gentleman, and I might add that I was talking to a friend of mine, and I think the statistics were something like 1 in every 10,000 Americans had a college degree in 1861. Is that right? Something pretty close to that. So that gives you an idea of the elevated status of a West Point graduate. Anyway, he was trained and educated as an officer and a gentleman, and he relished his status as an aristocrat. Promotion to Major General in the regular army, second in rank only to Scott, merely fulfilled expectations for a man of his talents, breeding, training, and attainments. Unlike the new Army commander, who was groomed for a career in leadership, Lincoln had no such background or birthright. The son of Thomas Lincoln, a hard-working laborer with a knack for storytelling, the new president received scant formal schooling. Nonetheless, impassioned with a quest for knowledge, young Lincoln mastered any book he could obtain. Among the volumes that shaped his mind over the years, Euclidean geometry and Blackstone's commentaries taught him to create order from a world of complexity and chaos. As an attorney and state politico, he retained the folksy manner of his past, which disguised a piercing intellect. Quick with a joke or a yarn, Lincoln reflected deeply and occasionally brooded, always poking, always probing, hesitant to commit until the precise moment. Lincoln's ways often obscured his magnificent mind and excellent judgment from the sight of those who did not know him well. In McClellan's opinion, the nation had chosen unwisely when it elected Lincoln as president. Lincoln did not measure up to McClellan's narrow view of leadership. In this time of crisis, the country needed a directed, forceful, energetic leader rather than the wishy-washy Lincoln. In Lincoln, McClellan sensed vacillation and weakness. After conversing with the president and the cabinet, McClellan visited Scott and important politicos. The hero's welcome he had received went straight to his head. "I find myself in a new and strange position here," he wrote to his wife. "President, cabinet, General Scott, and all deferring to me. By some strange operation of magic, I seem to have become the power of the land. I almost think that were I to win some small success now, I could become dictator or anything else that might please me. But nothing of that kind would please me. Therefore, I won't be dictator." Admirable self-denial. No, he said admirable self-denial, although I felt the same way. Crowds gathered around him and cheered him, senators marveling at his youth. Quote, "Give me my way in everything, full swing and unbounded confidence. All tell me that I am held responsible for the fate of the nation and that all its resources shall be placed at my disposal." After his first full day, he had already determined the causes of the failure at First Manassas. Delegating little responsibility, he spent long days in the saddle, inspecting troops, coercing soldiers to return to their units, reorganizing commands and commencing drill. His tireless efforts infused a fresh confidence in the ranks as well as in the civilian population. Now, McClellan built the Army of the Potomac, and the soldiers loved him for it. But with his organizational skills came some unanticipated baggage. McClellan, ever certain of his own judgment, attempted to dictate policy. On August 2nd, in a lengthy strategic assessment prepared at Lincoln's request, McClellan urged a shift of the entire focus of the war from the west to the east, where conveniently he was now located. The heart of his plan called for a primary army for operations in Virginia of 273,000 troops. which of course is a far cry from his 80,000-man strike force. He recommended Lincoln not make this a war against property and civilians, and went so far as to suggest an alliance with Mexico to maintain its neutrality. 6 days later, based on no hard evidence, McClellan insisted that the Confederate forces opposing him numbered 100,000. I urge that nothing be left undone to bring up our force for the defense of the city to 100,000 men before attending to any other point, he cautioned. Within 2 weeks, McClellan had sized up the situation to his complete satisfaction and had determined the solutions. He called for a reorientation of the war effort to his military division, escalated his needs monumentally, and through inflated estimates, doubled the enemy's strength. His behavior marked a pattern that endured throughout his tenure as commander of the Army of the Potomac. He vastly overestimated the strength and threat of the enemy, exaggerated his needs, hounded his superiors for a disproportionate share of the military resources, and then placed the entire blame for failure on their shoulders. Anyone who disagreed with him was either a fool or disloyal. Since politicians knew nothing of military affairs, they accepted McClellan's opinion, at least initially, as gospel. Scott, with nearly 50 years of military experience, did not, and McClellan targeted him first. Now, right away, McClellan set his sights on his superior officer. In mid-July, McClellan flattered the commanding general. 2 weeks later, Scott was, quote, fast becoming very slow and old, unquote. McClellan prepared an appraisal of the war in the Virginia theater on August 8th. In that, he brazenly challenged Scott's competence to assess the military situation. In response, a furious Scott reassured the Secretary of War that he had not the slightest apprehension for the safety of the government here. Yet Scott, tired and ailing, felt it was time for him to step aside for a younger officer, and he offered his resignation. Lincoln, though, declined the offer. McClellan, however, had just begun his assault on Scott for disagreeing with him. I do not know whether he is a dotard or a traitor. I can't tell which. Scott is a perfect imbecile. He understands nothing, appreciates nothing, and is ever in my way. General Scott is the greatest obstacle. He will not comprehend the danger and is either a traitor or an incompetent. These are all different remarks that he had about Winfield Scott, whom he considered his ultimate mentor just a few weeks earlier. As days passed, the military scenario worsened in McClellan's mind. On August 16th, the Confederates opposed him with, quote, 3 to 4 times my force. 3 days later, they had 150,000. By mid-September, quote, the enemy probably have 170,000. The nation, indeed, was fortunate that the Confederates hadn't attacked the nation's capital, as McClellan was quick to point out. When Lincoln held on to Scott, McClellan began an assault on the president. Quote, the president is an idiot. Another time, Lincoln was, quote, nothing more than a well-meaning baboon. Quote. Another time, Lincoln was, quote unquote, a coward. But Scott's days were numbered. And, of course, it was really sad because Scott weighed over 300 pounds, suffered from the gout. His body was deteriorating around him and couldn't concentrate any longer. When he was alert, his mind was still wonderful, but he couldn't sustain his attention span for any great length of time. So it wasn't unusual after a couple of hours for him to doze off in cabinet meetings and so on. So by late October, in fact, October 31st, Scott retired. To fill Scott's shoes, Lincoln turned to McClellan. The supreme command of the Army, along with the command of the Army of the Potomac, was an immense responsibility, Lincoln warned. I can do it all, replied McClellan. He had to do it all. McClellan trusted no one. Staff members performed few functions because McClellan failed to assign them specific duties. I have no one on my staff to whom I can entrust the safety of affairs, he complained to his wife. I mean, a sensible person would go out and get somebody they could trust to handle those affairs. Not McClellan. He didn't trust anybody, except perhaps his father-in-law to just a minimal degree. He immersed himself in details that he should have relegated to subordinates. Deep mistrust of others precluded him from delegating responsibility sensibly. On the day Scott retired, McClellan, with the aid of the prominent Democrat Edwin M. Stanton, assessed the Union war effort. McClellan argued that the fate of the nation rested with his army. All federal forces ought to work in unity, he proposed. I love this one. The entire military field should be grasped as a whole and not in detached parts. Then he proceeded to say that all the other armies ought to go on the defensive and they should send their excess troops to me so I can command them. That doesn't sound like, grasping the war as a whole. Anyway, he said that, quote, the advance should not be postponed beyond the 25th of November. But the 25th of November came and went. Politicians whom McClellan had cultivated now began to turn against him. By the late fall, his precious Army of the Potomac had grown to near 100,000 men, beautifully equipped, yet he squandered the best campaign months of the season, the fall. And politicians became more and more heated in their attacks against McClellan. In mid-October, McClellan implored the president, "Don't let them hurry me, is all I ask." Lincoln replied, "You shall have your own way in the matter, I assure you." If delays would ensure victory, Lincoln would gladly endure the public and political pressure. Then weeks and weeks rolled by, and McClellan failed to act. Whenever Lincoln sought information on McClellan's plans, his secretive commanding general rebuffed him. McClellan had the strange habit of overestimating foe and underestimating friends, especially Lincoln. He once described Lincoln as, quote-unquote, a rare bird, an odd sort of fellow. Every time he looked at the president, he saw the anecdotal Lincoln, the nosy Lincoln, the interloper Lincoln, the uncouth Lincoln, the weak Lincoln, the apish Lincoln. He found Lincoln a pleasant peasant, a nice enough chap, but wholly unsuited for the great position that he held. It never dawned on McClellan that there was more to Lincoln than met the eye. Having sized him up early, he refused to alter his judgment. The original guerrilla, that's quote-unquote as McClellan called him, manifested a depth that McClellan never noticed and could not fathom. While McClellan exhibited a powerful linear intellect, Lincoln enjoyed a splendid multi-dimensional mind. Like a child who explores a globe from above, below, and all around, Lincoln could examine every facet of a problem. He could comprehend difficulties and situations from the most unusual and refreshing perspectives. Then, with that uncanny, incisive logic, he could bore holes in any argument and reduce it to its fundamental weakness. Good humor and ready anecdotes camouflaged the workings of his genius, revealing only the core result. But Lincoln's intelligence was not merely destructive. On the contrary, he was a builder, a man possessed of true strategic vision. He focused on the end, a reunited nation, and adapted his ways and means to fulfill it. What McClellan perceived as weakness was in fact flexibility. Lincoln fixed his eyes rigidly on the goal and adjusted policies, programs, strategies, even personnel to move the nation toward that aim. All were tools to restore the Union. Slights from McClellan, ridicule from opponents, attacks in the press, and disappointment among supporters meant little to Lincoln. He could bear it because, in the final analysis, he knew that the American public would judge him exclusively on one point: whether or not his administration preserved the Union. Little else mattered. Lincoln's greatest drawback was a lack of military knowledge, but Lincoln was a quick study. By late fall, McClellan refused to divulge his plans. He developed a vague scheme to cooperate with troops in Kentucky, but that fell through when the Army commander out there announced he lacked the resources for offensive operations. But the reality was that McClellan's own personality lay at the heart of the inaction. Once again, he greatly exaggerated the strength of the enemy and undervalued his own resources. No matter how unrealistically his appraisal or how significantly certain factors changed, McClellan formed a snap judgment of the situation and refused to alter it. Excessively cautious, he detected obstacles where none existed and readily convinced himself to abort or delay operations. Then he absolved himself of culpability. He had not sought the position of responsibility, McClellan maintained repeatedly. God must have chosen him for a purpose. He had accomplished all that was humanly possible, but the government had withheld vital resources from his army. If his command did not assume the offensive or proved unsuccessful in battle, he was not to blame. In early December, an increasingly frustrated Lincoln decided to force McClellan's hand. The president offered his own scheme to outflank the Confederates from their fortified position in northern Virginia. McClellan rejected it, but admitted, quote, "I now have my mind actively turned to another plan of campaign that I do not think at all anticipated by the enemy, nor by many of our own people. That was it. No details, no clues, merely a cryptic message about some plan he had. In fact, the plan that he had was the Urbana campaign, and that is shifting his army by water down to Urbana on the Rappahannock River and then advancing overland. It actually wasn't a bad plan. I'll talk about it in a minute. But then typhoid fever struck. It was one of the great scourges in the Civil War, and McClellan came down with it. With McClellan bedridden, Lincoln felt pangs of anxiety. Who would orchestrate strategic operations in McClellan's absence? After worrying about it for a while, McClellan spoke to the Quartermaster General, who recommended that he bring some politicians and a couple of the most high-ranking commanders in McClellan's army together, and that's what Lincoln did. He asked them to come up with some options, and they proposed two plans, one like the Urbana campaign, another one an overland campaign. The next day, Lincoln held a second conference, and the officers agreed on the overland campaign, something, to attack the troops in the Manassas area, the Manassas-Centerville area. Well, when McClellan caught a whiff of the meetings, he grew furious. He suddenly became well and showed up for the third meeting and made a miraculous recovery, and there he blasted his officers for participating and created a really icy situation. He insulted the president and everyone else in the meeting. He refused to divulge his plans in the meeting because of all sorts of people who he claimed were incapable of keeping secrets or incompetent to judge. He literally said, quote, "If the president had confidence in me, it was not right or necessary to entrust my designs to the judgment of others." Can you imagine telling the President of the United States that today? Then he went on to say, some were incompetent to form a valuable opinion, and others incapable of keeping a secret. McClellan did set on a date, and that was enough for Lincoln, so the President said, and so the meeting adjourned. In fact, the President was not satisfied at all. Lincoln began taking the situation into his own hands. The first thing he did was remove the Secretary of War, Cameron, and replace him with McClellan's old friend, Edwin M. Stanton. McClellan was overjoyed with the appointment initially, but he soon came to despise his new superior when Stanton refused to let McClellan have his own way all the time. Within weeks, they clashed. It was not long before McClellan branded Stanton, quote, "without exception, the vilest man I ever knew or heard of," unquote. This was the guy he had just claimed was his best friend. Obviously, the same thing that afflicted Scott afflicted Stanton. It must be the yes name. Nor did Lincoln relax his pressure on McClellan. In late January, he ordered all land and naval forces to move against the enemy on February 22nd. And then Lincoln rejected the Urbana plan. After a briefing, Stanton eventually convinced McClellan he ought to brief the President of the United States, the Commander-in-Chief, your boss. Lincoln concluded that the Urbana proposal merely altered the site of confrontation and delayed the date of advance. Troops at Manassas were the target for the Army of the Potomac. McClellan squawked. His proposal had merits that the President apparently did not grasp, and he requested permission to submit the reasons in writing. Lincoln concurred. But before McClellan completed the task, Lincoln posed 5 fundamental questions about the two plans that addressed the cost in time and money, the likelihood of success, the benefits of decisive victory, and the consequences of disaster. If McClellan resolved these issues to Lincoln's satisfaction, he could undertake the Urbana campaign. Well, the Urbana campaign did have merits. First of all, you would probably, if you pulled it off, you'd be able to fight on ground of your own choosing. Secondly, it might force the Confederates to attack the Federals in prepared works. Third, it utilized the Union's naval superiority. And fourth, it had logistical benefits. It's easier to supply an army by water than it is by land. Instead of emphasizing these concepts, McClellan responded with a 3,500-word discursive essay of exoneration, excessive detail, and wishful speculation. He diluted the strengths of his plan in a morass of digressions. I can't help but make a digression of my own. When Lincoln asked Grant for why he was doing something or about his question about his plans, Grant would send back a 5-sentence reply. Because Grant could just get to the heart of the matter. I'm doing this because boom, boom, boom. That was it. McClellan has to write 3,500 words. That is what? Ed, 15 pages, typescript, double-spaced, something like that. That's pretty sad when you can't explain to the president in shorter terms than that. Well, Lincoln eventually relented because he felt he couldn't force his own plan on his commanding general. But over the next 6 weeks, Lincoln saw little to restore his confidence in McClellan. Delays continued. Then the Confederate Army in Manassas abandoned its works on March 9th. When the Union Army investigated the works, it became apparent that the Confederates had perhaps 50,000 men, not the enormous numbers that McClellan had claimed. And the proximity of the new Confederate position to Urbana made a landing there utterly unfeasible. And so now McClellan had to choose a new location for his landing, and that was, of course, Fort Monroe. His plans for Fort Monroe, however, had not accounted for the rampages of the Confederate ironclad Virginia. I won't take time to discuss those things, but I assure you they created heartburn for McClellan, Lincoln, Wells, Stanton, and many other people, especially people who are on the Minnesota. In response to McClellan's blunders, Lincoln took a more active hand in overseeing the campaign and the war in general. Lincoln asked McClellan to create corps. McClellan wouldn't do it. So Lincoln created 4 corps and assigned the senior division officers to command. Lincoln also dictated March 18th as the deadline for the advance. And twice he specified that McClellan must leave a force sufficient enough to safeguard Washington and the area of northern Virginia. Then finally, just a few days before the campaign was to begin, he relieved McClellan as general-in-chief. Lincoln's faith in McClellan was clearly shaken. To an old friend from Illinois, Lincoln described McClellan as a man who organized well for the campaign, but as the time to move forward arrived, he quote, became nervous and oppressed with the responsibility and hesitated to meet the crisis, unquote. With his presidential directives, Lincoln hoped to prod McClellan over the hump of indecision. Lincoln failed. Rather than driving intrepidly on to Richmond, McClellan landed his army and crept forward at a snail's pace. His bold words vanished in the face of armed opposition. Confederate Commander Major General John B. Magruder and 13,000 Confederates bamboozled McClellan into thinking he led a large and powerful force, a force equal to McClellan's own. McClellan advanced by regular siege approaches. Worse yet, a battle fought in the Shenandoah Valley by the Confederate Major General Thomas J. Stonewall Jackson tipped Lincoln to McClellan's non-compliance with the stipulation that he leave sufficient force behind to protect Washington and hold Manassas. Lincoln, therefore, immediately blocked the transport of an entire corps. Now, it's pretty clear that Lincoln badly overreacted to the whole situation with regard to Jackson. In fact, in one moment of frustration, Lincoln intimated that McClellan, quote, must either attack Richmond or give up the job and come to the defense of Washington. So Lincoln overreacted to the situation. McClellan had a better perception of what was going on, but of course his inflated numbers of the Confederates didn't realize that Lee was attempting to use Jackson's movement in the valley as a means to draw away vital Union reinforcements so that Lee could fight on a reasonably even battle, reasonably even playing field. McClellan begged Lincoln to restore the First Corps. In my deliberate judgment, the success of our cause will be imperiled by so greatly reducing my force when it is actually under the fire of the enemy and active operations have commenced, he pronounced. It justified, at least in his own mind, his lapse into excessive caution. Ultimately, the president provided 2 of the 3 divisions, plus many more reinforcements, well over 32,000. So that by the height of the campaign, the Army of the Potomac reached just a few thousand men shy of 130,000, McClellan's projected strength. According to the general's own timetable, the First Corps would not have arrived before the fall of Yorktown anyway. But that meant nothing to McClellan. He had convinced himself that a giant conspiracy was afoot. His enemies in Washington sought the defeat of his army. Back and forth, McClellan and Lincoln bickered. McClellan demanded the additional manpower, arguing that he needed it for the colossal battle about to take place, while Lincoln urged him to break the enemy lines at once. When McClellan insinuated the government had not sustained him fully, Lincoln replied that the complaints, quote-unquote, pain me very much. In a telegram tinged with sarcasm and rife with blunt advice, The president wondered whether McClellan felt 20,000 men was enough force to resist an advance on Washington. This is a question which the country will not allow me to evade. He admonished his subordinate to attack immediately. Time aided the Confederates, who received reinforcements and fortified. McClellan could only receive additional manpower. And once more, let me tell you, it is indispensable to you to strike a blow. I am powerless to help this, Lincoln exhorted. Lincoln reminded McClellan that by transporting his army to the peninsula, he was, quote, only shifting and not surmounting a difficulty. In frank terms, he explained, the country will not fail to note, and is now noting, that the present hesitation to move upon an entrenched enemy is but the story of Manassas repeated. Such forthrightness from the president should have caused McClellan to shudder. He discounted it. McClellan knew best how to conduct a campaign, not the commander-in-chief. To one of Lincoln's telegrams proposing that he sever the Confederate lines, McClellan penned his wife, I was much tempted to reply that he had better come and do it himself. Methodically, McClellan positioned his artillery to blast the rebel entrenchments. Just as the Federals arranged everything for a major push, Magruder abandoned Yorktown. Again, McClellan crept ahead timorously. As he edged up to the Confederate trenches, the size of the enemy army loomed larger, so that it outnumbered his nearly 2 to 1. Every shred of evidence indicated that the rebels intended to defend Richmond with, quote, all the troops they can collect from the east, west, and south. Then he went on to beg that you will cause this army to be reinforced without delay by all the disposable troops of the government. Suddenly he claimed he couldn't bring more than 80,000 men to bear against the Confederates, when 3 weeks earlier he admitted to his wife that his effective force was over 100,000 men. Lincoln attempted to channel the remainder of the First Corps, subsequently increased in strength to almost 40,000 to McClellan's army. As long as it continued to shield Washington, McClellan obstructed the shift. He objected to the overland route instead of water, even though the direct march was shorter and quicker. Then he protested over the restrictions on his use of the Corps. Everything had to be on his terms as he had planned it originally. Well, of course, Stonewall Jackson then began his rampage that diverted the First Corps. Instead of reinforcing McClellan, Lincoln opted first to dispatch the First Corps to the valley. Lincoln saw this as an opportunity to trap the Confederate Army under Jackson. McClellan viewed it as a campaign to maintain Confederate military superiority around the rebel capital. In fact, even though McClellan had assumed the offensive, he had surrendered the initiative. His basic theory of command, encapsulated in a comment to the Secretary of War during the Virginia crisis, rested in the belief that, quote, we must take it for granted that the worst will happen, unquote. In late April, he bemoaned his plight. It is more than probable that no general ever was placed in such a position before. Finding myself thus unexpectedly weakened and with a powerful enemy strongly entrenched in my front, I was compelled to change my plans and become cautious, unquote. As his army inched its way up toward Richmond, he telegraphed to Lincoln, I wish to strengthen its force as much as I can, but in any event, I shall fight it with all the skill, caution, and determination that I shall possess. Then, with the church spires of Richmond visible in the distance, he sounded more like a besieged commander about to capitulate than the leader of an aggressive army. Situated as I am, I feel forced to take every possible precaution against disaster and to secure my flanks, obviously not very well, against the probably superior force in front of me. The closer McClellan approached to Richmond, the more fear of failure dominated his thoughts. Just after McClellan had discounted the possibility of Johnston attacking him, Johnston did attack him at Fair Oaks. Now, the Confederate attack there was extraordinarily disjointed, and Union heroics enabled the Federals to hold their position. At first, McClellan was crestfallen, but as a day passed, he came to the realization that his troops had performed very well. Our troops charged frequently on both days, he boasted, and uniformly broke the enemy. A couple of days later, he sent a message to Lincoln. The morale of my troops is now such as I can venture much, and do not fear for odds against me. The victory is complete, and all credit is due to the gallantry of the officers and men. Then, as days dwindled by and the moment of truth approached, McClellan's enthusiasm for the final battle cooled. Cries for additional manpower campaigns to draw away some of the overwhelming Confederate strength, and the usual excuses bombarded the War Department over the next 3 weeks. Since Halleck's army had just captured Corinth, Mississippi, an important railroad junction, McClellan wanted the War Department to ship some of those troops to him. Well, that's a feat. Or ordered Halleck to occupy Chattanooga, a scant, 400 miles away, maybe? Or Dalton, Georgia. When Robert E. Lee, who succeeded Johnston to command, sent away some troops to assist Jackson, Lincoln thought, quote, "It is as good as a reinforcement to you of an equal force." McClellan interpreted the move as an illustration of Confederate strength and confidence. To his wife, he justified his hesitancy on the dearth of leadership in Washington. "When I see such insane folly behind me, I feel the final salvation of the country demands the utmost prudence on my part, and that I must not run the slightest risk of disaster, for if anything happened to this army, our cause would be lost." On the eve of the major thrust against Richmond, intelligence information convinced McClellan that he faced 200,000 rebel soldiers, well over double Lee's strength of approximately 85,000. Sources suggested that additional rebel reinforcements from the west had arrived, and that Jackson's army had slipped down from the valley to spearhead a flank attack. The news wholly unnerved McClellan. In an insubordinate tone, he absolved himself of culpability for the crisis, having warned the War Department repeatedly of my greatly inferior numbers. If the impending battle resulted in disaster, he concluded, the responsibility cannot be thrown on my shoulders. It must rest where it belongs. McClellan's horror of failure had seized control of him. Lincoln promptly scolded him, insisting, "I give you all I can, and act on the presumption that you will do the best with what you have, while you continue ungenerously, I think, to assume that I could give you more if I would." Remember, McClellan had been General-in-Chief a few months ago. He knew exactly how many troops were in the Eastern Theater. Lincoln went on to say, "I've omitted and shall omit no opportunity to send you reinforcements whenever I possibly can." But the rebuke did him no good. Based on intelligence reports, McClellan took precautions to fortify his right wing against Jackson. But on June 25th, massive graycoats stormed McClellan's right flank. Poorly coordinated, haphazardly executed, the initial assault failed to break the Federals, but Lee refused to let up. Over the next 6 days, his troops relentlessly hammered the Army of the Potomac, driving it back from Richmond. Only sloppy Confederate staff work and lackluster leadership, along with some stout Union resistance, prevented McClellan from suffering a catastrophe. McClellan buckled under the stress. He abdicated complete control of the battlefield to subordinates and unaccountably squandered his time on rear echelon staff duties. Incidentally, a Navy man was the one who determined that the Army would fall back to Harrison's Landing, and the Navy man, in a letter to his wife, noted that McClellan hadn't slept throughout the 7 days battles and was sound asleep on his ship, and that, quote-unquote, he was in command of the Army of the Potomac. And the guy was not a braggart. I mean, he was making it as a casual remark. He slept little, ate insufficiently, and thoroughly exhausted himself. As he admitted to his wife, quote, "You can't tell how nervous I became." 2 weeks after the campaign ended, he elaborated, "I did have a terrible time that week," he confided to his wife, "for I stood alone without anyone to help me. I felt that on me rested everything, and I felt how weak a thing a poor mortal erring man is." The pressure and sense of isolation caused him to collapse emotionally. His messages to authorities in Washington, initially confident and composed, soon degenerated into near hysteria. After the first day, he blustered, "If I had another good division, I could laugh at Jackson." 2 days later, as Confederate attacks compelled his army to abandon the field, McClellan pined, "Had I 20,000 fresh and good troops, we would be sure of a splendid victory tomorrow." He was not responsible for the retreat, he charged the next day to the Secretary of War, and if the government wanted victory, quote, "You must send me very large reinforcements and send them at once." His concluding remark, which was so outrageous that the telegraph operator in Washington deleted it intentionally, shifted the entire burden of defeat on Lincoln and Stanton. "If I save this army now, I tell you plainly that I owe no thanks to you or any other persons in Washington. You have done your best to sacrifice this army." By July 1, his requests had reached absurd proportions. "I need 50,000 more men. and with them I will retrieve our fortunes. More would be well, but that number sent at once will, I think, enable me to assume the offensive. Within 3 days, his needs exceeded 100,000. Confronted with failure, and so desirous to shift blame onto others, his demands lost all semblance of reality. Throughout the fight, Lincoln endeavored to soothe his frazzled commander. When news of some disaster first reached Washington, he urged McClellan to yield ground but save the army at all costs. Once the army was secure, Lincoln dispensed some sobering remarks. He requested that McClellan allow me to reason with you a moment. When you ask for 50,000 men to be promptly sent to you, you surely labor under some gross mistake of fact. As the former commanding general, McClellan certainly knew the disposition of forces. Outside McClellan's army, the Union had barely 75,000 troops in the entire region. The idea of sending you 50,000 or any other considerable force promptly is simply absurd. Lincoln did not hold McClellan responsible for accomplishing more than he could do reasonably. I only beg that in like manner you will not ask impossibilities of me. Rather than admit the near rout, within days of the end of the campaign, McClellan transformed the affair into one of the great military achievements of all time. The extrication of his army from the clutches of overwhelming Confederate superiority, the stoutness of Union resistance, and the manner in which he shifted supply lines from the York to James River in the midst of retreat manifested the brilliance of his ability to command. To his wife, McClellan crowed, "We have accomplished one of the grandest operations of military history," unquote. He pouted after a telegram he received from Lincoln exhibited, quote, "a fatal want of appreciation of the glorious achievements of this army," and then proceeded to instruct the president, "When all the circumstances of the case are known, it will be acknowledged by all competent judges that the movement just completed by this army is unparalleled in the annals of war." He had done his best, he insisted over and over to his wife. His conscience was clear. Any blame rested elsewhere. He eventually dispatched his father-in-law, his chief of staff, Randolph B. Marcy, to Washington to answer questions about the event. Marcy carried a letter from McClellan seeking, quote, "rather much over than much less than 100,000 men." Over 100,000 more reinforcements. In this immense crisis, quote, "we require action on a gigantic scale, one commensurate with the views I expressed in a memorandum to the President submitted early last August, calling for a 273,000-man army in Virginia." Well, of course, the Union lacked the capacity to feed 273,000 men in Virginia. 273,000-man army, I should say, in Virginia. And by implication, Lincoln had listened to him. And in fact, he was referring back to his old preposterous plan, saying, if you had met those terms like I told you to, none of this would have happened. Well, after Marcy's briefing, Lincoln decided he better go down there and see for himself. And he did that, steamed down there. The condition of the army surpassed his expectations. When he talked to corps commanders, they were undecided about what he should do. And Lincoln refused to tip his hand, and that bothered McClellan. "I do not know what extent he has profited by his experience," McClellan pondered after Lincoln left. "Not much, I fear, for he really seems quite incapable of rising to the heights of the merits of the question and the magnitude of the crisis." Incidentally, as Lincoln boarded the vessel to Washington, McClellan handed him a letter which he boasted to his wife will save the country if Lincoln acted on it. It's the famous Harrison's Landing letter. Now, the policy paper called for a restrictive war, one against the Confederate Army and its government. No effort should be undertaken to subjugate secessionists or confiscate property, including slaves. A declaration of radical views, especially upon slavery, will rapidly disintegrate our present armies, McClellan predicted. Now, people have branded McClellan as disloyal or his acts disgraceful for the Harrison's Landing letter. Personally, I feel that they're really being unfair. That is, he's the ranking general officer. It's his job, confidentially, to advise the president on all military matters, and that's what he did. The problem with the Harrison's letter is he missed the boat. He didn't understand the changing nature of the war. And what it showed was that while Lincoln was moving in this direction, McClellan was still stuck over here, perhaps even moving in this direction. Furthermore, his timing couldn't have been worse. He had absolutely no credibility with Lincoln, but he thought he had achieved a great victory in the 7 days' battles. So he thought that the president would certainly do what he had told him. Of course, Lincoln didn't adopt the plan, although he did adopt one component of the plan, and that was to reinstitute the post of commanding general, and he selected Henry Wager Halleck as that man. Of course, McClellan thought he would be selected, that's why he proposed it. Halleck's first job was to undertake the task of resolving McClellan's status on the peninsula. Halleck went down there armed with a commitment for up to 20,000 reinforcements. When he proposed it to McClellan, McClellan said that's not enough, he couldn't accept that. Then the next day, after thinking it over, he said he'd try, quote unquote, he'd give it a try with 20,000 men. Halleck returned to Washington. Within a week, McClellan continued to press Halleck for more men, and eventually the commanding general concluded that the Army of the Potomac plus 20,000 could not advance in its present position and strength, and McClellan felt 20,000 wasn't enough. The reality was nothing satiated McClellan's demands for additional resources, as Lincoln explained to an old friend. If he provided the Army of the Potomac with 100,000 reinforcements, McClellan would be euphoric and vow to capture Richmond within days. But the next day, he would receive intelligence information that suggested the Confederates had 400,000 troops, and McClellan could not proceed without more men. Lincoln's great with the stories. Of course, Halleck's decision infuriated McClellan. Previously, Halleck and McClellan had communicated rather well. All of a sudden, quote, "The dolts in Washington are bent on my destruction." Another time, "The more I hear of their wickedness, the more I am surprised that such a wretched set are permitted to live, much less occupy the positions they do." Halleck soon came to be called, quote unquote, a scalawag, and on another occasion, very dull and very incompetent. Well, of course, Halleck ordered the shifting of the army to the north. You know about the Battle of Second Manassas. McClellan actually withheld forces from Pope's army. He could hear the battle and withheld forces from Pope's army, which in fact might have saved the day, or certainly couldn't have hurt the situation. Then, you know the story as well. McClellan got reinstated. Lincoln felt he had no alternative. The army needed to be reorganized. McClellan was a great organizer. Even with the Confederate plans in his hand, McClellan bungled the affair at South Mountain. Then he eventually fought Lee at Antietam, where, in my opinion, McClellan probably fought one of the worst battles in American history. I mean, it was inexcusable the way he flew his forces into that engagement in a piecemeal fashion. He should have been able to finish Lee off, and he failed to do so. In the aftermath of the quote-unquote victory at Antietam, the president issued the Emancipation Proclamation. You can imagine how much that infuriated McClellan. He was livid. And then, of course, after Antietam, McClellan refused to move. Lincoln went up there, explained the situation. He still refused to move. Lincoln threatened him, sent friends up to threaten him. McClellan refused to move. Since July 1861, Lincoln had coddled, cajoled, wheedled, needled, nudged, reasoned, and commanded McClellan to campaign, all to no avail. But then, when the order for his removal came, he confessed, quote unquote, "Of course I was very much surprised." I guess I'm kind of running out of time, so let me sort of skip down and just sort of summarize in the end. For George McClellan, this was just one in a long series of failed command relationships. Of course, happened was McClellan was removed from command, ordered to New Jersey, eventually asked permission to go to New York, and that's where he ended up, in New York, and never, of course, commanded an army again. For George McClellan, this was just one in a long series of failed command relationships. A brilliant, difficult individual, McClellan had left in his wake a history of miscarried associations with superiors dating back to his youth. Since childhood, McClellan had struggled with authority figures, from grade school teachers to West Point instructors, to superior officers in the regular army, to railroad bosses. McClellan's psychological baggage impeded his ability to function as an army commander and general-in-chief. Mistrustful by nature, he discovered deliberately threatening or demeaning remarks in innocuous comments. His excessive secrecy, need to dominate, and hypersensitivity to rank and power inhibited his capacity to labor under the supervision of Lincoln, the Secretary of War, or the General-in-Chief. McClellan formed initial or preconceived expectations and clung to them rigidly, obscuring all information that contradicted the original assessments. He grossly exaggerated the strength of obstacles, took extreme precautions, and in failure blamed everyone except himself. Severely critical of others, he reacted bitterly to criticism and justify himself at every turn. These qualities, all symptomatic of someone who is afflicted with what psychiatrists and psychologists call paranoid personality disorder with narcissistic tendencies. There's a mouthful, huh? Prevented McClellan from performing his duties as commanding general and general-in-chief satisfactorily. Throughout the course of the Lincoln-McClellan relationship, the president had supported his general wholeheartedly. He articulated military goals for his commander and provided the necessary manpower and equipment to accomplish them. McClellan, paralyzed by his personality disorders, lacked the capacity to utilize the troops effectively. Thank you very much. Anyone have any questions? Yes.
In the letter to his wife about assuming dictatorship right after he got to Washington, do you think what the phrase admirable self-denial, that he meant that literally? I've often had trouble believing that even McClellan...
No, he meant it sarcastically. Yeah. Yeah, no, he was joking. He was joking. That's why I put an exclamation point next to it. At least in my mind, he was. Yes?
Has anybody ever looked at his post-war in light of what you've done lately and see how he performed as governor and whether this continued on throughout his life?
He has the same problems when you look at his post-war career. He can't, Burnside was his best friend before the war. You can't stand Burnside. He breaks contacts with all sorts of old friends. He doesn't function well. He can function as governor. Why? Because he's El Jefe. He's in charge. He can't function in any situation where he isn't in charge. I mean, you look at his life, and his life is glutted with these episodes. His whole military career, his childhood, his work as a railroad executive, it's glutted with problems with superior officers. I mean, he even admits it. Let me see. I've got some quotations here from his younger days. It's amazing. I mean, he says things to his sister-in-law, for example, that he can't believe. Let's see. I don't think I am of a quarrelsome disposition, but I do have the luck of getting into more trouble than any dozen other officers. In other words, causing a stink. Time after time. The only instance where he doesn't have problems in the old Army with his superior, I'm excluding the Mexican War, his service under Scott, which is a very brief duration and it's under a different scenario, is when he serves under his future father-in-law, Marcy. And the reason is he's in love with Marcy's daughter. So he's not going to tick off the father, his prospective father-in-law. And then, of course, eventually, Marcy serves under him. So he's in the power position. McClellan can only maintain relationships if he's in the power position. He trusts virtually no one his whole life. His wife, Fitzjohn Porter, he trusted Burnside a while, but then dumped him. It's just amazing. The ground is strewn with casualties. Ed?
How did he like Barnard? Since Barnard courted his wife at one time.
Who did?
Barnard, John Brooke Barnard.
I don't know.
Courted Ellen at one time, and Mrs. Barnard raised his hell because Barnard is a classmate of Pop.
I didn't know that, but I do know about the A.P. Hill affair, of course. A.P. Hill had gotten, gonorrhea? Yeah. So that's why his reputation was not good enough for the Marcys. But Nellie really was in love with A.P. Hill, and eventually they broke up, and McClellan was able to maintain a good friendship with A.P. Hill. They had been roommates at West Point, but of course it was easy for him to retain it because after all he got the woman that they both coveted. Yes?
Ask you, I guess, kind of on a similar subject, comparing Joseph Johnson to McClellan. To me, they've always seemed kind of...
They're similar, but dissimilar. In my opinion, McClellan's got psychological problems which make him dysfunctional. I mean, I genuinely feel that he's dysfunctional. Johnston isn't dysfunctional in my mind. Johnston's one of those people who can't rise up to the level that the war and Jefferson Davis expect of him. For example, Johnston gets assigned the whole, that Western Division, which encompasses, among other things, Pemberton's army and Bragg's army. Well, Johnston can't imagine commanding two armies that are 300 miles apart. Because he can't imagine how you would command at that level. His idea of commanding is to be on the ground, to order tactical movements. You know, that's the way he perceives command. And he can't envision any other means. He lacks that strategic vision, I think. He lacks the ability to rise up to that next level. The level where Lee actually functions magnificently. And Johnston just can't seem to do that. Johnston has great difficulty planning because, I mean, you look at even his battle plans, they're dreadful. They're dreadful. Ed gave Freeman's assessment of 7 Pines, and it was a crappy plan. And the aborted plan before that was a horrible one. And then you look at, for example, Peachtree Creek. That's exactly 7 Pines plan. It's exactly the 7 Pines plan, where the Union Army's crossing Peachtree Creek and he's trying to split right through. It's the only concept he came up with. You know, I mean, he's just really, he really lacks imagination. Think about it. If you were in command, put in command in 1864, actually late 1863, you're going to be fighting up in the Dalton region, and you knew you were going to have to fight on the defensive until you had an opportunity to counterattack. Wouldn't you have taken a little time to prepare some defensive positions on the way back to Atlanta? That's not asking miracles, folks. That's just good judgment. Johnston can't think on those terms. He's incapable of planning ahead. I mean, his retreat from Manassas Centerville back to south of Rappahannock, he hadn't laid out the camp. Can you imagine? And he wasn't moving under duress. I mean, can you imagine retreating without determining where you're going to stop? I mean, you know, this is crazy stuff. He just lacks. What the hell is he doing all day long? That just defies me. I'm a big Johnston fan, too. I like Sherman, I like Grant, I like Lee, I like Jackson.
Following along those lines, and Lee seemed to have a very high opinion of Johnston. Was that, you think, based on ability, or just that Johnston was of the right rank and there wasn't any other options?
Well, you know, you look at it from Lee's perspective. They went to West Point together. Johnston was an outstanding soldier, you know, in the regular army, because he was functioning on a lower level. You know, when you're functioning on a tactical level, you look at the ground and you make a decision. The decisions are right in front of you. But when you have to function on a level beyond tactics, you have to envision things. You have to see things that your eyes don't observe. Do you understand what I'm saying? And that's where I think Johnston has failures. Lee doesn't really get to see that much. And of course, Johnston's all Lee's got. Who's he going to put in? Braxton Bragg? I mean, so I think he has a lot of faith in Johnston, probably more than Johnston deserves. Ed?
Would you think outside of Lee and a few, most people that are staff or engineer or come out of staff background have that problem?
Do I think that?
Yeah.
Probably.
He's a staffer. They go outside of Lee, go into these staffers, they have problems.
That's probably true. Off the top of my head, I can think of I can't think of any good commander other than Lee, who came from
that staff job.
That's right. That's right. I can't think of any of them. Beauregard eventually becomes okay, and he's sort of a staff. You know, by 64, let's face it, Beauregard's a good soldier. You know.
Outside of Meade has problems.
Yeah, Meade does.
Longstreet was line originally.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. They didn't have a command and staff car.
No, they didn't. No, they didn't. Or Army War College. Did you have a question?
Yeah, or a comment, really. Despite all the good things that happened, you're talking about the Battle of Leningrad,